Hey Warwick, how you going? How's that for timing? Round of applause for Warwick, thank you. I am going to be looking at legislative compliance, I guess end to end in the Act. So I know we've got some people here from local government, we've got some people here from state government, some people out here from consultancy. Most of it's going to be relevant to all of you. Because even in the areas where we're talking about, I guess, governance in terms of assessment managers and assessment panels and things like that, nonetheless, for those of you that are interacting with relevant authorities, that's going to be relevant, but also a number of you here are accredited professionals and therefore relevant authorities in your own right. So, so a lot of legislative compliance functions are relevant to all, as well as, of course, governance functions, because the concept of I guess the accredited professional scheme and some of the obligations that come under that are fairly new concepts. And also we've got provisions now that talk about delegations, for instance, which have some caveats and rules that apply to accredited professionals that are out there in the private sector as well. So we're going to hopefully give you content that's very relevant for an entire 3 hours for all of you. Now, I'm happy to take questions throughout. So I understand yesterday there was a really good discussion. I understand that David got everybody into groups and you had to work through a DA under extreme pressure. I'm not going to quite do that, but I think, like I tend to say, you've got me paid for 3 hours. That's a considerable saving. So make the most of it. I'm quite happy to take questions from the floor. If any one of you stump me, and I'd encourage you to give it a go, I'm quite happy. I'll take a question on notice and I'll feed an email back through to Jane to distribute to the group. So quite happy to do that as well. And I think, do make the most of the opportunity to pick my brain, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of the flashpoints from sort of the lawyer's point of views in the system, because I think, everyone that's come in today is just remarking about how busy everybody is with the new system and also with the way the economy's been. I mean, we've seen unprecedented levels of development happen during the pandemic. That also leads to disputes. We've got an entirely new planning system, and where some of the disputes are happening and how they're turning out is really, really interesting, because there's a lot of unexpected results, and there's also a lot of unresolved debates, which we're probably going to need to have some judgments from the ERD Court or the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal before they're fully and finally settled. And they're arising in areas where there might be a difference of one word in the PDI Act from the Development Act, and everything's turning upon that one word. Because what lawyers are very good at doing is we argue about words. That's our job. I mean, unless we're prosecuting someone for doing something naughty, when we're arguing in court, it's often about the legal interpretation of a word. And so everything can turn upon a slight change in legislation. And as we're getting more familiar with it, and as these disputes are coming out, we're identifying words that all of a sudden some of my colleagues at different firms have a different interpretation of. And we're seeing a lot of commercial competitive disputes coming up where there's big money being thrown at planning appeals. We've got hoteliers playing off against each other where there's prime tourism developments happening, and some people want to get theirs in first. So we're actually seeing huge amounts of judicial review litigation in the Supreme Court where there's a huge amounts of financial backing. So, as I said, make the most of it. Happy to take questions throughout, and definitely happy to have some experiences shared as well, because I think a lot of the value of these sessions is actually sharing information between each of you here. So you're all fantastic planning professionals. There's a lot of seniority in this room as well. So let's get it out there and get it going. Okay, so better grab my clicker. And I'll have to remember as well that I'm being videotaped as well, because I'm normally quite frank in these sessions, so I'm a little slightly nervous.
Is it working? Is the
I think
no, it's
sorry. Jane's going to have to show me how to use this.
No.
Very embarrassing. Yeah, that's it. Come and get your legal advice from Victoria Shute at Kelledy Jones. With all of her wealth of experience, you can't operate a clicker. Oh, thank you, Jane. I've been redeemed. Thank goodness for that. Okay. Look at that. Beautiful. So what I'm going to cover off, the key topics in this session. So governance is overarching, but I do have an hour on that, so we'll leave that to the third part of today, just before lunch. I'm going to talk quite a bit about accreditation because I've actually been quite intrigued by the amount of queries that are coming up about accreditation. I'm also intrigued, and this will be very relevant to a lot of you here who are managing teams. A lot of people are finding it very hard to get used to the accreditation scheme, CPD requirements and renewals. So we've seen a lot of people who all of a sudden are not accredited. And the question then becomes, what on earth happens when our assessment manager doesn't have an accreditation in place? And also for those of you that are accredited professionals levels 3 and 4, very, very important. Development assessment, I'll talk in general about the various points. I mean, we all are looking at the regs when it comes to verification. We know what the requirements are. We're all dealing with site contamination, and that is just huge at the moment. So what I'll do, instead of going reg by reg, and I understand that, you know, almost weekly you're doing that with Plan SA, we'll talk about the key issues. I'm going to talk about things like discretion to depart from the requirements when you exercise that, but also there's a lot of arguments about when is a change of use occurring, when is it a change to a more sensitive use. How do you determine the site when there's been multiple uses on the same allotment in the past? What if there's been a long period of no use? These questions are coming up so regularly, it's not funny. Assessment as well. There's a lot of discussion out there about weighting of DOs versus DPFs and POs. And, you know, lots of different opinions about that. Hot off the press last night, I've got an opinion from Michael Roeder QC and James Roeder. It's a really contentious matter, so we've gone in double-barrelled with Roeder squared. And they've got a really interesting interpretation, which I think is open under Part 1 of the code, about how you apply a DO versus a PO and what takes precedence if there's going to be an argument about its interpretation. Going to talk about determination of DAs as well and conditions. Part of that I will be talking about deemed consents because they are happening frequently. There's been a lot of activity in litigation over deemed consents, but we've not gone to a judgment because every single one to date has resolved, and I'll tell you why. Reviews and appeals as well. Lots of interesting interpretations. I won't dump the planning firm involved, but I saw one the other day about how far an assessment panel can go when reviewing an assessment manager's decision at particular points in time, so we'll talk about that. And of course we'll round off with some compliance and enforcement functions as well and where they're going in terms of compliance issues. So to begin with accreditation, I've got to reiterate with what I've seen over the past few months that this is the absolute starting point for legislative compliance for each of you in the room, regardless of whether you're accredited or not, because you know, I think the importance of the accreditation scheme can't be understated. It underpins the ability of just about every decision maker under the Act to make a decision. So accreditation is actually used in two contexts under the PDI Act, and this makes it very, very difficult sometimes to actually read and apply provisions of the Act and actually the accredited professional regulations as well, because an accredited professional is used in the sense of having an accreditation which then entitles you to be appointed to a role. So that's more in the context of the state government, local government environment where, you know, an accredited professional needs to have that accreditation to become the assessment manager, to get the appointment of the assessment manager. Assessment panel members need to have their planning level 2 accreditation to entitle them, if they're independent, to be appointed to a panel. But when we get into the accredited professionals as being relevant authorities for deemed to satisfy forms of development, that's actually a different context. But the confusing thing is about the Act is that the term accredited professional is used throughout. So there was a deliberate move, and I think this was very carefully considered, to not use the term private certifier in the Act. For our building colleagues, the term building certifier is used in a limited degree. But the intent behind calling everybody an accredited professional was to elevate the role of the scheme and to make it clear to people working in the private sphere or the public sphere that the scheme is very, very important. And also to send a message out to the public that, look, we're not only just accrediting those who are working privately, but if they are working in the public sphere or consulting to the public sphere, they have to maintain, and adhere to our accreditation scheme. So where some of the difficulties arise is we're seeing in sort of the local government context, a lot of people have got auditors in, preparing themselves governance-wise for the incoming auditing by the State Planning Commission. So we do have some people who've sort of, on the front foot and getting audits done already. And a lot of auditors are saying, well, you've only got one planning level 1 accredited professional in your team. You don't have any 2s, 3s or 4s. We actually think you need lots more accredited professionals. Maybe you should have your whole team accredited. Why well, I'm reading, we're reading here that there's this term accredited professional. What are you doing about that when you only have maybe one in your planning team? And that is coming about as a result of the way that term is used in 2 different contexts, but the Act itself doesn't make it entirely clear which context it is unless you read the whole of the Act, the accreditation scheme, the accreditation regs, and actually work it all through. So really, really important. For the assessment manager, they always have to be accredited professional planning level 1. That's it. They can't have, they have to be. They can't be any way around that. But Section 100 of the PDI Act makes it very clear that relevant authorities, and it says other than accredited professionals, can delegate their functions and powers, and to paraphrase, to whomever they see fit. So there's no restriction on the ability for the statutory position of an assessment manager to delegate functions and powers. Accredited professionals levels 3 and 4 in private enterprise can't delegate. That is very, very clear, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But there is implicit in Section 100, and you can link it back to 82 and then all the provisions around the 90s that talk about who the relevant authority is when, that when it comes to an assessment manager who can only be based in some form of a statutory entity, whether that be local government or a joint planning board, or at the SCAP, for instance, that there is some sort of oversight and some organisational control over what the assessment manager is doing, when and why. So linking it back to Section 87, the assessment manager, when it comes to a council assessment panel, is appointed by the CEO of the council. So there's a line of report there. The assessment manager's performance, they're answerable to the CEO of the council. So it then follows that Section 100 implicitly recognises that the assessment manager is already answerable to the council CEO. They are within a public entity. And therefore, there is an expectation that when the assessment manager delegates, they will delegate to people who are appropriately skilled and have the appropriate expertise to deal with a development application, because ultimately the decision on any development application where the assessment manager is the relevant authority remains the assessment manager. They are ultimately responsible for it. And it's like the old system where, decisions on planning applications had to be made by a council staff member or a panel, but the council was ultimately the decision-making authority. It's that same sort of legal structure. So that's why we have that distinction there. But certainly for a lot of councils, it's simply cost prohibitive to have your whole team accredited at level 1. It's also impossible to have a situation where the assessment manager has to endorse every single application that comes to the assessment manager. Whilst a lot of team structures are endorsing. They're using the endorsement function. A lot of them are choosing to use that for particular types. You know, they're undertaking a risk assessment based upon the resources that are available to each team. But certainly when the auditors come through and say, and this is not the state government auditors, these are private auditors, they'll go, we think you should have 5 accredited professional level 1s. Good luck, you know, and it's not a legal requirement because your assessment manager will be level 1. They are then answerable through various chains of commands and legislative arrangements and structures of the bodies that they work for where they're answerable to that. Yeah, Renee?
I've always thought it was a bit of an odd setup that you have an assessment manager who then delegates to whoever they see fit. I've never quite understood why there isn't a requirement for all of the planners to be at least qualified if not accredited. Do you think that'll ever come in at some point? Or?
I think there'll be a lot of resistance to that because look, at the time when the accreditation scheme was being set up, and I had the benefit of working as a colleague with one of the people that was responsible for drafting the scheme and setting it up, is that naturally the rural and regional councils said we will never be able to staff this. We will never be able to get people to actually do this unless it's on a consultancy basis, because we just don't have enough people who'd actually want to live out in our areas who would qualify for level 1. So I think there'll be a lot of pushback, and then they'd have to look at structuring it for metro versus regional, but then that means that you'll have, instead of a one-stop shop planning system that's consistent across the state, it's then going to have variants of it. I think the commercial reality now though is just about every single council area outside of metropolitan Adelaide has a regional assessment panel. Because with panels, every panel has only one assessment manager. So Kayla would be familiar with this. Out in the Eyre Peninsula, there's a 10 council RAP. The Eyre Peninsula RAP has every Eyre Peninsula council except for Whyalla. And Whyalla are a part of a RAP with, they call themselves the Upper Spencer Gulf, Port Augusta and Port Pirie. So for the EP RAP, the assessment manager is Jess Burns, who's employed by the Port Lincoln Council. They have a service arrangement where everything's based out of and administered out of Port Lincoln. She is planning level 1, but then through delegations, a lot of the small scale decisions are either made by consultants or they're made by paraplanners, administrative staff, because if you're talking about a place like Streaky Bay that has 2,000 ratepayers, there's no way that they'd be able to get someone through to do planning on a day-to-day basis for farm buildings, outbuildings, sheds, verandas, caravans, all those little things that form the majority of the DAs. When it comes to the bigger things, you know, if they have a major agricultural development or something quite contentious, they'll get a consultant in to do it. But that's more about recognising that they need that level of expertise for particular DAs rather than the overall delegation structure. But yeah, certainly, I think it would be very political if they went down that path. And the reality is as well, look at who our new Minister for Local Government is. You know, we've gone back into the fold of having someone from local government be that minister. I'd expect as well politically over the next 4 years that just won't be a palatable option. So one thing I've found intriguing as well is this question of panel membership too. So, one decision that I don't necessarily agree with is that if you want to sit on a panel, you have to have a separate level 2 accreditation regardless of whether you have a level 1 or a level 3. I think there's some room there for that to be amended, because the upshot of that is that if you are maintaining both level 1 and level 2 or level 2 and level 3, you have to do considerably more CPD at great cost than somebody who might be making arguably some more, if you're level 3, you could be making some quite large decisions, whereas if you're level 2 sitting on a cap, or if you're level 1, you're going to be making some very big decisions. But if you're sitting on a cap, you do that by consensus. It's in a group of between 3 and 5 people sitting as a panel. So I think that's probably an area that needs looking at, because doing 30 hours of CPD every year is, in my view, unsustainable. especially because the mandatory units, there's no crossover as well. By comparison, lawyers only need to do 10 a year. So the accredited professional scheme, particularly around CPD, they haven't reinvented the wheel. You know, they've got applied similar requirements in terms of the governance arrangements to other mandatory CPD schemes. And for lawyers, we only have 2 mandatory units. This will make you laugh. One of them is ethics, which is common. And you could debate about the ethics of the legal profession, probably for 3 days or so. But actually newly introduced for us is we have to do a compulsory unit on sexual harassment and bullying as a result of the recent, kind of inquests into the legal profession. But yeah, 10 hours a year. And for a lot of lawyers that are working as sole practitioners, they might be doing criminal defence work, which might have serious implications for people's liberty, and 10 hours is considered enough. So my personal opinion is I think 30 to maintain level 1 and level 2 is just, it's not sustainable in the longer term. And I think there's some good grounds to actually say, well, if you're level 1 in particular, why can't you be given 2 and 3 as part of that? Recognising that we have the accreditation scheme with its planned auditing to make sure you're doing the right thing in every context. It's just a thought. Level 3 and level 2 accreditation, of course, for those of you that are maintaining those levels of accreditation, you do need to keep across of your renewal dates, your CPD returns and things like that. I think the CPD system is very similar to what I'm subject to, and it was a bit of a learning curve for the legal profession to keep it, to get it moving and to get those kind of structures in place to remind you to do your CPD. What P has done is very, very timely with getting the CPD points in. Our various providers always run, 1 or 2 day intensives to make sure everyone can tick it all off in the one hit. But you do need to make sure you're doing your returns. The audit system will no doubt operate similar to other statutory CPD auditing schemes. So the general structure is you keep your records of what training you've done where and what mandatory units they attribute to. You keep that in a table. That usually forms part of your return to make sure that your accreditation is renewed. If you do get audited, they're auditors, and they'll be looking for basically proof that you attended and what the content was. So a certificate of attendance is normally good. If they had some queries about whether the session was, legitimate, was bona fides, it had the right content, keep a hold of your slides. Just make sure that you've got a record attendance and the slides. That's enough. Having been audited recently, I claimed some credits for presenting, and they wanted to actually see that I'd made some notes. So if you're claiming presenting internally to talk to your team, which you can do, so just make sure that somewhere on a file, whether you do hand notes or typed up notes, that they're saved somewhere, that if someone asks the question, you can go, here you go. Seems a bit, again, when you've got those processes in place, you've got a repository to save everything to. It's very, very helpful. I'd suggest as well for those of you that are working in councils that you keep your own records, because of course if you want to move on, your accreditation is personal to you. It's not something that is assigned to the organisation. No doubt if someone was to quit today and go to a new employer, there'd be discussions between the employers about who's going to pay the balance of fees for the year, and is there going to be some arrangement about, do we want some reimbursement, all that sort of stuff. But you need it, obviously if you move from organisation to organisation, you're going to need those records kept personally as well about your CPD requirements if you're asked the question. Because again, the scheme makes it very, very clear, as an accredited professional, the responsibility is on you individually to comply with the scheme. I just wanted to mention as well for those of you that are managing teams, the accreditation obligations for building officers and building surveyors are a little bit different in the context of a council structure because of regulations 112 and 113 of the PDI general regulations. So what those provisions provide is before certain building related decisions can be made, the advice of an accredited professional at the relevant building level needs to be sought. Also, when it comes to inspections, you need to have at least one authorised officer appointed who's at level 3 or level 4. So the regs are quite explicit about who can do those building functions. Also, entitlement for appointment to the Building Fire Safety Committee is limited to buildings level 1 and 2. So in the building sense, there is a need to have more than one accredited professional on your books, because and it depends on your team structure. Some councils, because of course building decisions, when it comes to a building consent application, actually remains with a council if somebody wants the council to approve them. So if you're getting a lot of building applications through, you still need to have the resources on board that if a building, if most of your building applications are coming in at, the level 1 level, which is class, everything except class 2 to 9, which is, over 3 stories, or I think the floor limit is 5,000 square metres, the really big commercial developments. Having one person at level 2, and maybe if you're doing lots of inspections, someone else at level 3 or level 4 might be sufficient. For those who are in smaller councils, they're using consultants for that role. So, country councils will normally have someone like Peter Harmer, who's very well known to all. He's level 1, he'll help with the building fire safety things and the very complex assessments, but they might have, someone else who's coming out and doing the day-to-day kind of, level 3 and level 4 assessment work and giving that advice. There's no restriction on a delegate of the council being accredited, so it's quite appropriate for all of the decisions to be made, whilst the regs say you've got to seek the advice of. If the person that the council is seeking the advice of is the accredited professional, no problem with that. But yeah, especially if you get the auditors through and you're doing that yourself and you're getting the private ones in, they'll ask the question, you need to have more building officers accredited than you will need to have planning officers accredited. Talking about CPD, I mentioned my opinion about the amount of CPD that you're required to do, and I do think there's a good case for reform there. But I think a couple of issues that are coming up. There's been a good half dozen assessment managers that have become deregistered because their accreditations have not been renewed because they didn't submit their CPD reforms, records and the fee. Legally, if someone is appointed as the assessment manager, or if they're an authorised officer with prescribed qualifications and the basis for their appointment is wiped out, they are no longer appointed to that role. The entitlement to become an assessment manager or a panel member is wholly contingent upon, legally, being an accredited professional at the right level. So we've had some situations where decisions have been made where not all of the panel are accredited at the time, but they don't know, they haven't realised. We've had some instances where assessment managers have not been accredited. Legally, they've gone and they've made decisions, they've issued consents, they've issued approvals. Legally, there is a concept with development decisions that once they're made, they're final. So there's a Latin term that gets thrown around a lot, functus officio, and this goes for everybody, regardless of whether you're out in the private world or you're in a council or state government context. Once a decision is made, it is final. Whilst it might have defects in the decisions, unless the applicant knew about that and there was a cosy deal, a bit of corruption or serious maladministration going on, if the applicant was unaware that there were defects in the decision still stands until a court overturns it. And why that rule applies is because of the impacts of a development decision. If you're an applicant and you've got a planning consent and you're going on to getting your full development approval, you need that certainty. The law recognises that that's a very significant decision for you. Lots of money is going to be spent. And ultimately, remember, our PDI Act limits the ability of landowners to do what they want with their land. So decisions will stand. If there is a procedural defect, if a next door neighbour wants to go to the ERD court and say, well, the decision is no decision because the person who made it didn't have authority, the ERD court's quite likely to agree. Whether the ERD court quashes a decision or not is up to their discretion, but until that happens, the decision does stand and it carries through. So if you are, again, managing people who are accredited, make sure that there's some sort of central register about accreditation dates, get that in place. Whether you put it on them as individuals, they're all employment issues, but it really, really does need to be kept made aware of. I think the biggest flashpoints we're seeing is with CAP members. And look, it is their responsibility to be accredited and to maintain their accreditation, but I think if you're the assessment manager and you're looking after the CAP, keep a register of people's accreditation dates. You can get that, it's publicly available if you don't want to ask them to give it to you, but just some sort of a requirement, or perhaps in their conditions of appointment, give us proof of your accreditation and its renewal. You know, if you're going for 2-3 year terms for your panel members, put it back onto them. Because what will invariably happen, and having got up at Sparrow's Fart this morning to deal with one such issue, is you get some, particularly with resident groups who are very unhappy with panel decisions, they will, if they don't get any love with the merits decision made on a planning application, they'll start attacking the players rather than the bowl. And so what you will then get is complaints to oversight bodies. You might get a 270 review under the Local Government Act because it's not a planning merits decision. You might have to, your governance officers might have to do the 270 review. And I think the risk is not so much that the developer's going to be upset because their decision is no good. The decision stands, but it'll be tens and tens of hours of work with the lawyers involved, dealing with all of the oversight processes. So definitely keep that in mind and try and make sure that... Sorry?
Not for your curveball.
Yeah.
Decision. You're saying the decision's correct.
It's not correct.
But it still stands.
It stands.
But what about? Okay, there's been cases in the eastern states and that where, and it happened to me here, that the insurance company basically first thing checked if I've got all approvals for the whole house.
Yep.
Say if they went through that and then they found that the decision was not, the panel wasn't correct, the insurance company turned around and said, well, sorry, your policy's invalid.
Possibly.
And the bank?
Possibly.
And the bank as well?
Possibly.
So that opens a big can of worms for everybody. Because the mum and dad doesn't know, but then they do their due diligence, because I know for a fact the banks, there's been a court case 5 years ago in Victoria, where a lawyer purchased a house and the back part of the house hadn't had approval and it burnt down.
Yeah, I know that one.
You know that one? So I'm getting phone calls from banks and saying, we're selling this property off, it hasn't got approval, can you do retrospective? So this is throws a big curveball for everything. Yeah.
And I guess when I say legally the decision stands, I'm talking about under the PDI Act and what that leads on to in terms of a legal entitlement for somebody to undertake development. But liability and insurance law, whole separate area of the law. And it's happened here a lot. I think, just over 10 years ago, I was working at a different law firm that had an insurance law practice, and they had a client, it's public knowledge, it made a mainstream media news, but they owned a rental property, detached dwelling, had a masonry and steel fence with a gate attached. The family that was renting it had 2 small children. One of their children swung on the gate and the column to which it attached collapsed on him and his sister. He died and the sister lived but with serious brain damage. The insurer sent out the assessors because it was going to be a very big claim. And the insurers went through the entire development history. They went to the council, got all the records, they audited everything, and they found out that the fence was never approved. Given its age, the person who owned the property at the time wasn't liable for getting it approved. It had been built maybe 10-15 years before they had purchased the property, but the claim was denied. And where the legal argument was about was whether the insurance company could do that, given that the owner of the land had no idea that it wasn't approved. And the insurance company's response to that was, You get a Section 7 search when you buy,
That's right.
and it lists conditions of consent. And this is where the argument started to go, because you know, your search certificate just lists conditions that continue to apply. So then the question is, well, you know, does that mean I've got to check that everything's approved? But this is where it gets very, very nasty, very nasty. And because I think the rule with insurers, in my experience over way too many years, is that if there's money to be saved, that's when they're going to start denying claims. You know, if it's a small little thing, you know, if it's maybe up to 5 figures, they won't bother. But if we start to venture into the high 5s and 6-figure sums plus, they will send the assessors out and they will do their job. Yeah. And you know what I'm saying, because you know, the eastern states landscape's really interesting. One thing, just taking a little segue. In New South Wales now, if you're a building designer of any ilk, you've got to be registered before your plans count for a development authorisation. So New South Wales have gone, the architects are doing a bad job from the outset. We need to bring them into the fold. And we're starting to see cases where, you know, people are getting looked at very carefully because of apartment buildings with huge structural defects. And wherever there's an out for an insurance company, they'll just take the out. They don't care about the morals of it. They're there to make a buck, and it's just horrible, horrible stuff.
The engineers over there now basically have to be insured.
Yep.
Because the state government didn't have them with those oval towers and all that. And I know because a family member of mine is in a legal action, class action against the New South Wales government for not indemnifying the engineers. We're talking about $50-60 million.
Well, I've encountered a situation recently where we had a client that was asked by a developer. They were retrofitting a very small apartment building, so you know, 4 units, 2 stories, kind of 1960s red, you know, kind of you'd call it a 6-pack, but it's a 4-pack job, and very, very unattractive. But refurbishing it to make it look pretty. And there was an assumption, because they were just doing balcony works, you know, nothing affecting the downpipes or anything like that. There was an assumption made, quite rightly, I think, that existing downpipes and stuff would be kept in guttering. But then in the build, they wanted to add it on, but they've come in at a bad time. So their builder and the building designers are not accredited. So to just put downpipes in and to get them approved on plans to get a construction certificate modified, they actually have to get an entirely new designer in who's accredited. It's, yeah, I think we'll probably see that over here eventually when some of the defects with Class 2 buildings over here become very, very apparent.
I think it's worth following David Chandler on LinkedIn, who's the Building Commissioner in New South Wales, and seeing some of the stuff that's being talked about in that context.
And I'll talk about a bit about this in sort of the compliance function, but we are starting to see a lot of cases listed for hearing about ACP cladding, and where there's disputes with building fire safety committees about whether that has to be removed, replaced in total, or whether there's some partial can remain, and the insurance arguments about that, and where that's all going as well. So it's happening.
Is
Yep.
there an issue if only, let's say, a panel does have an accredited professional that's lapsed, but the quorum is still okay?
I think that's less of a problem. But again, it's an insurance issue. I think, you know, a lot of it's just risk and bad luck. But I think if it was one person, it's going to come down on them. From an oversight perspective, complaints to an oversight body, the accreditation authority doing an audit, it's an individual liability from that angle, Don.
I think just one thing to note or watch out for is the time factor. So Nicola remembered this last year, is I was down to the day of the panel meeting and I'm waiting and hassling the accreditation authority for, can you confirm the re-accreditation so I can attend the panel meeting tonight? So,
and
you know,
one thing I think that needs to be kept on the radar as well is the accreditation authority is taking upwards of 3 months to make decisions, which I think, given the individual implications that carries with it, it's wholly unacceptable. Absolutely wholly unacceptable. If we're going to have a state-based accreditation scheme that is going to be managed by a department, essentially, and not by some sort of hybrid governance model, They need to have the resources to give people responses within a timely fashion. So I'm talking 2 weeks, not 3 months. I've seen people who, have needed accreditation to carry on with their job, especially in the transitional provision, and they've not had a response for 6 months, and it's an area where I think quite reasonably there needs to be some change. Because other professions that are subject to similar requirements, so land surveyors, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, their accreditation's actually managed through a professional body. The Law Society has a statutory role in administering our CPD scheme. So they've got some statutory recognition, but they're an incorporated association. Same with the land surveyors. The Surveyors Board is an association, so they have a different mandate because they exist, yes, to advance the interests of the profession, but a large part of their function is just accrediting people. So they get their decisions out much, much quicker. And that might be a model that the government needs to look at, maybe when they can be more satisfied that Class 2 buildings aren't going to go up in flames. Moving on to verification, I think a few flash points at the moment. So, the verification requirements are deliberately comprehensive and strict, because I think one of the countermeasures to the very strict assessment timeframes for planning consents in particular is that the intention is we have a uniform quality of development applications on the portal, which then proceed on to assessment. But there is an element of discretion as to whether prescribed plans and details of particular sorts are required or not, and that ultimately lies with the relevant authority. So, the question is going to be one of reasonableness if you are departing from the verification requirements, and it's fact and degree. A clear one is you don't need levels where you know that the land is flat. We've got the really obvious examples. Where we're seeing a lot of contention at the moment is where applicants are saying that requirements are not required for verification. No one has yet pulled the trigger on an appeal to the ERD court about a failure to verify, because keeping in mind, of course, applicants retain the ability to appeal every assessment decision. It doesn't even need to be a decision, it could be a decision not to make a decision. Everything is open for applicants to appeal. But I suspect we might be seeing some applicants who want to take a matter on appeal. And I think one of the big flashpoints for that at the moment is the site contamination documentation. Because that came in, and I'm very intrigued about the timing. I mean, how long's that been bandied around for? Was it 20 years that the EPA has been discussing actually having site contamination come in and be integrated with the planning system? And then we get phase 3 on the 19th of March 2021, and then on the 24th of March we then get the site contamination requirements. And I'll just leave it as being intrigued by that timing. But look, I think what the flashpoints are, the concept of the change to a more sensitive use, where you've got a large allotment and where there were multiple uses happening on the site, where there was historic uses. Because the practice direction which you have to read to determine changes to a more sensitive use and what the hierarchy is, does actually pick up vacant to a new use to be a change to a more sensitive use. So vacant land is dealt with. But what we're seeing a lot of questions arise of is where you might have old horticultural land, particularly in outer Greater Metropolitan Adelaide, land that might have been under vine, but then a house block with some space out the back, because it might have been formerly in a rural living zone, has been allowed for. The vines were ripped out and the remaining vines are on a separate allotment, with the idea being to separate the house from the horticultural activities. What happens if the footprint for a new building exceeds where the house was? Maybe there's some leeway there, but what if it exceeds into an area that might have been under vine? And on a very, very strict reading of the regs and the practice direction, that could be interpreted as being a change to a more sensitive use. There is, understandably, because of the costs involved with obtaining even a phase 1 report, a lot of objection to that and saying, well, hang on, we think there's some discretion to depart from that, and particularly if there's just a land division, we don't think it's quite triggered. There's a lot of action amongst lawyers about that at the moment. And I think the best advice I can give on that is it's a risk management question. The question has got to be, what if you don't require it and there is contamination? That's where it needs to be considered, because the practice direction is pretty comprehensive. It's clear in most instances, and yes, applicants will be disappointed if they do have to provide extra documentation, but the question's going to be a what-if question. Yeah, David?
Situation. Sorry to interrupt, but
No, go for it.
I want to identify the council budget developments at Port Hughes, and the land was rezoned about.
I didn't hear where that was. Thank you.
Okay, all right. And I probably should have said that.
I think I'm familiar with it. It's zoned, ready to go.
It's zoned ready to go. All the land's been subdivided into residential allotments. There was a contamination assessment done when the land was rezoned by Parsons Brinker. General farming land, just farmed, no contamination identified. Land wasn't developed immediately, and the land has been farmed in the meantime. Council is saying that the contamination assessment report that was done is no longer relevant because the land's been farmed in the meantime. So now the question is, does every single one of those allotments have a contamination assessment?
And this is where the problems arise. I think there needs to be, practically, for the entire industry's sake, I think there's some refinement that needs to be looked at in the practice direction, because we are seeing, and this is not just that particular council area, but it's a vexed question for the relevant authorities, because when you apply the practice direction and the sensitivity hierarchy, well, it can be interpreted that way, and I think this is the issue as well, is that what if we consider this to be low risk, and because the practice direction doesn't allow on its strict reading any element of discretion, and so that always then causes, understandably, a lot of concern. Okay, we're going out on a limb here. What if, because I don't have that ability to make a judgment call or a value judgment. There's numerous ways of dealing with it, because I think knowing a bit about the history of that practice direction, where it's come from, it's an EPA viewpoint of the world, okay? So we're looking at... It is. We're looking at our peak environmental regulator going, we want this looked at in a very strict way. But that means that a lot of developments that don't need to be caught are going to be caught. And as we see, they've had a look at the boundaries of the EFPAs. We're going to see more expansion, and we're seeing pressure as well on old industrial land going for residential development. We've got large portions of inner metropolitan Adelaide where, you're thinking about your Bowden, Bromptons and things like that. West End Brewery.
There's no question when you're dealing with those sorts of changes that
I know.
But it becomes a bit of a vexed issue when you're dealing with general farming land that's had a plough run over it, a bit of fertiliser added to it, and maybe a bit of Roundup every now and then. But in those sort of circumstances, I think the general consensus is, unless there's been a building on the land or a cheap dip or something along those lines, then the chances of it being.
And I think some nuance in the practice direction would be helpful, because I know your circumstances, David, but you're also dealing with different levels of skill and knowledge at different relevant authorities. So, if you're dealing with particularly the rural and regional councils, there's a huge risk profile there. There's not the skill base necessarily to go, I'm comfortable making that decision, but also, in the metropolitan context, there's plenty as well. It's not just limited to country areas. There are plenty of sites where, for whatever reason, there's been site contamination reviews, auditing. It might have been part of the risk management process for the entity that was there, but still, in a lot of circumstances, that documentation doesn't fulfil what the practice direction is calling for. And I think there's a need for some dialogue there and some feedback about where the roadblocks are. It does have a flip side in that it is helpful in some cases where previously the ERD court said you can't require a phase 1 unless you actually know that there's contamination there. So I was involved in a matter where within the heart of Port Adelaide there was a residential block, zoned residential for as long as there was a development plan, For many, many years, the block was landlocked, and its history was, before Port Adelaide got main sewer, it was designated to be a soakage trench. Right, so it was a rectangular piece of land surrounded by allotments facing St Vincent Street with, kind of shop house combinations, and then on the sides there was a stables, local heritage places of course, and then workers' cottages with this allotment in the middle. So the soakage trench was probably not there, but we don't quite know. But forever it had been used as car park. Industrial chemicals may have been stored there at some point in the past because of some of the activities that were going on and who the ownership arrangements were. But fast forward to the 21st century, a boundary realignment's done to give it an axe handle with a street frontage. Residential development is proposed, and the questions asked, should we require a phase 1? Because we know that just about all of Port Adelaide is contaminated, and this allotment is going to have, that the future house is going to have a backyard, and people are going to access the soil. There was pushback from the applicant, and there is a decision at Scrag in the City of Port Adelaide Enfield. Commissioner Moselle at the ERD court said, no, you can't require a phase 1 because you're hypothesising.
How much can you rely on the declaration of the application that there's been no contamination? I mean, surely the applicant in signing the declaration is saying, well, look, it is understanding.
And I think there's probably some room for debate about how far do you go in looking into that. But I think what the practice direction doesn't do is it doesn't give any discretion. It's drafted in that sort of mindset of strict application, and also kind of, as has become kind of commonplace with a lot of statutory functions, almost putting the onus on discovering site contamination onto, kind of that more local level of government rather than resting with the EPA.
It's all very well, but as you say, some of that contamination occurred 100 years ago. And, nobody's going to have any understanding of what happened there.
Yeah, and I really think there's some grounds for sort of some nuance to be built into that. And I think, when there is feedback given, because we're still getting, the regular kind of, sessions, we've got a new government, there is some, I think it needs to be looked at, because a lot of people are being put to great expense, but at the same time the decision makers don't have an out. So the question's going to be, what if? And you're going to get some decision makers that go, I'm going to take this and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to, I'll be prepared to justify my decisions. But some people aren't as, are more risk adverse, and this is just, it's human nature. Also, I think I can't stress enough, when verification is complete, your assessment timeframes kick in. Deemed consents are a real flashpoint at the moment, and I mentioned before they are happening very regularly. In some cases, I wish for a deemed consent, because that would be a lot easier than dealing with representors. But there are relevant authorities who are getting them regularly, and a lot of the times they're looking at them and going, okay, they're going through. But where there's flashpoints, regulated trees, there's flashpoints over heritage to a degree as well. Where there's been a history of multiple development applications seeking approval for the same thing, all of them are refused. They strike it lucky and get a deemed consent. And really, it's these matters are getting very, very, very nasty. So with a deemed consent, I think all of the scary predictions that the lawyers were giving have come true. If a deemed consent is issued, it's easy. Applicant waits for day 0 to pass, they click a box, DNF's generated, goes up. The relevant authority then bears the onus of applying to the ERD court to have it quashed. So legally, it's not just a notice of appeal, it's an application supported by an affidavit. And the ERD court is aligning with that, so that's what they're requiring. You can't just do a notice of appeal. You immediately need the lawyers involved, because when you start doing affidavit evidence, you don't want to chance it. The questions that are coming up with matters that are going on deemed consent challenges is, first of all, what is the concept, where does endorsement go? So a matter that has come up was where an assessing officer uploaded, just before the end of the assessment period, reasons for refusal, the assessment report, everything to indicate that the planning consent was going to be refused. But what hadn't happened was endorsement. In that context, is it the case that the ERD court can actually hear the merits review and go, oh, well, it was that close to being refused, let's not remit it back. Let's actually take it as a full refusal and we'll go straight to the planning appeal. The answer is probably no. It's more of a judicial review process. And so the question's going to be, why wasn't the decision made within time? And to date, what that starts to get into is questioning the officer's integrity. Why didn't you make a decision in time? There was a matter involving a regulated tree where there had been 6 separate attempts previously to have it approved for removal. Every single one of them refused. And on the 7th go, there was a deemed consent because time ran out. As is the case, the person who owned the tree really wanted it gone, so they lawyered up. They had solicitors, they had a barrister, they had young Mr. Rhoda from Howard Selling Chambers, and he's like a dog with a bone. And so it turned into the deemed consent matter initiated by the relevant authority. An argument then came, then there was an appeal against the decision not to grant a development approval. So we started getting into arguments for, if something is not building work and I've got my deemed consent, Section 125 of the Act doesn't say that I can't get my development approval. On the portal, it moved towards a development approval. You've not issued my development approval within 5 business days. I'm appealing that decision. So then it became 2 court matters. And also there was questions asked about process. Okay, why didn't it get approved? And what had happened, unfortunately, during the time was COVID. There was illnesses, there was absences, there was workplace issues going on. But they would have been agitated in the ERD court. And whilst from your team's perspective and as an employer's perspective, they're all very, very relevant, the ERD court doesn't care if you are under-resourced. The ERD court doesn't care if you're a planning officer and you're not going to get toil, or you're not going to get flexi for staying half an hour behind and actually making a decision. They don't care. You're a decision maker. You didn't make it. Statutory authority. Fine. That's not a legitimate excuse. So this is what's happening. They're becoming, when they do happen and there is a challenge, they get very, very nasty very quick if the money's there to spend on the right lawyers to do it. So I can't emphasise enough the importance of monitoring timeframes. Yeah. Can I just say as well, the same tree survived a poisoning, Renee. The same tree, river red gum. It almost died and then it grew back as if it had been in a bushfire. Yeah, it did. Look, that was the old. There was lots of factors. The tree is gone. But sorry, sorry guys, we've got to keep going on. But the matter was settled. But you can just see where it goes. And, there was lots of questions going to be asked. Uncomfortable questions, reputational questions, management questions. And also for the poor individual officers concerned, their integrity being questioned. Which if you're leading or managing a team, if you've got an officer who gets taken, is compelled to give evidence in the ERD court and their integrity is questioned and they get bullied under cross-examination, that then has knock-on effects to the organisation as well. So I can't stress enough, it's actually better from a legal perspective if you just refuse an application and deal with the merits appeal. I don't like to say that, it's not what the Act intends, but from an irrelevant authority's perspective, it is actually better to refuse and to deal with it through an applicant appeal than it is to consider a deemed consent as being a challenge as being an option.
We
And
got a deemed consent last week, I think, it is going to the panel next week. So we're going to beat into it and get a decision. So, because it was the one that had reps that needed to be heard. So hopefully that works.
yeah, look, and I think you can still, like, if they haven't clicked the deemed consent button, it's not a deemed consent. So until the applicant actually gets the decision made, it's not a decision. So even if you're out of time, that's fine. And a lot of applicants would rather have the proper decision made because applicants do recognise as well there's a lot of uncertainties with the way that the deemed consent process works. But if you do get one that, and we could tell from the Plan SA records, the applicant's lawyer had logged on every single day, because as you would have seen from the portal report, it logs who's logging in when and what they're accessing, So it was one of those situations where they were waiting. You might have some deemed consents that you want to be deemed consent, you might want, but there's lots of questions, and the question then becomes, what if the representations haven't been heard? Is the deemed consent valid? Because there's been a necessary statutory process that wasn't followed. What if you're waiting for a referral agency? And yes, the regs say if they don't respond within the time frame, then you can take it that they don't want to make a response. But what if they've been slack and it's state heritage? There's a lot of unanswered questions. So yeah, I can't stress enough. I think legally, from the cost perspective, we love it. Come to us. You can pay me. Keep me busy for the next kind of 6 months arguing them. But I think from a risk profile, just stay away. Do keep in mind as well, substantial variations actually reset assessment timeframes as well. So if you do an RFI for further information, after verification and you get variations through that are substantial, clock resets back to day one or day whatever, because we count backwards. This is really important, and it also means, like it was under the old system, that if there was a representation process, it's gone out to public notification, that needs to be repeated as well as referrals. Some issues with representations that are coming up. The perennial ones, representatives wanting to put last minute information, catching people by surprise, representatives not appreciating that they aren't owed natural justice or procedural fairness rights when they make a representation. In fact, if anyone's owed them, it's the applicant. More and more panels are coming up with meeting procedures to manage those processes, but where there is last minute information, it's really got to be through the assessment manager and with the final say-so of the presiding member. Prepare for there to be criticism on that, but ultimately the whole system is preventing a person with interest in land from developing their land without approval, so they're owed the ultimate procedural fairness, and that's enshrined in the Act, which allows the applicant to respond to representations and not the other way around. There's a lot of questions now with the significant lessening of representative appeal rights. There's lots of joinder applications coming through. There's a couple that are going to the Court of Appeal where representatives have decided to join an applicant appeal where there's been a refusal, and they get joined and the relevant authority and the applicant settle. And so the current legal arguments are centring around, in those circumstances where the relevant authority has agreed that this development should be approved, is allowing the joinder at that point, is that elevating the assessment pathway from performance assessed notified up to restricted? And is that unlawful and improper? So there have been some cases from single judges of the Supreme Court where they said that's fine, but that's gone on to the Court of Appeal. So we're expecting in the next 3 to 6 months that there'll be a final, hopefully a final ruling on that very, very issue. Panel decisions and assessment manager decisions. I think everyone's had panel decisions very well done for a long period of time. Assessment panel reports are pretty standardised. We've got around, I think, concerns about copyright. I would still like to see the portal having the user pay system where, you know, people can get approved documentation from the portal as is intended. We're not quite there yet, but it will happen, no doubt. And I think the advent in the planning portal for there to be some records of reasons for decision for an assessment manager or an accredited professional is very good. Whilst a lot of people have said this is a waste of my time, it actually protects you in the event that there is some questions about what decision you made and when. And actually, if and when auditing takes place as well, it means that there's a consistent register of everybody's documentation in a consistent way on the portal. So they are very, very important records, and I think that's been a really, really good development. There we go. A few other legislative compliance issues. Panel conduct is a big issue at the moment, and a lot of councils from an organisational perspective are, and I think properly, encouraging more of a customer service approach to dealing with ratepayers, dealing with members of the community. And whilst the council's role with its panels is limited to appointing the panels, there is nonetheless quite a common desire to make the panels a bit more user-friendly, particularly for representors. So the trend seems to be across the majority of panels to be a bit more gentle with representors, particularly if they're not represented by a planning consultant or a lawyer. So things like, you know, if somebody talks for slightly over 5 minutes, the presiding member saying to them, look, it's your 5-minute warning, I'll let you go for a little bit longer, but you have to finish, instead of, right, 5 minutes done, you're up. Also, community expectations are changing as well. So I would encourage, if you are the assessment manager, you're working with the panel to, you know, to explain that to them, particularly if you've got presiding members who've been around for a very long time, when the panel procedures used to be a bit more judicious. Times are changing. And I think from a legal perspective as well, what we tend to find is that the questions, the complaints, the reviews, the ringing up the CEO at all hours of the night and saying this wasn't fair, that can actually be prevented in a lot of cases by a panel recognising that they're not a judicial body. Yes, they're a decision maker, but they make their own meeting procedures, and they can, where they deem appropriate, you know, be a bit nicer to representors. You don't need to cut down at the 5-minute point and just say, I'm not going to hear from the rest of you. It needs to be managed, but to be sensitive to those expectations out there. Reserve matters, expectedly, are being used more often. So for those of you that are looking at reserve matters, Section 102(3) of the PDI Act is deliberately much broader than the former reserve matter provisions under the Development Act. So the most useful one is 102(3)(c), which allows a reserve matter where there needs to be another statutory authority, consent, permission, approval granted by another decision maker under another act. Do be aware that for planning consents, the relevant authority is not the council. So there is the ability to use a Section 102(3)(c) reserve matter where somebody needs a Section 222 permit before they can operate their business in accordance with their development approval. There's also the ability to consider that where there might need to be road upgrades, Section 221 authorisations. It is legitimate under the PDI Act, and it can be a very good tool to make sure that an applicant gets their planning consent within time with that certainty, and also being compliant with the PDI Act, whilst dealing with peripheral issues through a reserve matter. This is particularly important because I think a lot of experience from a lot of people that are talking to me is getting the engineers organised can be really tricky sometimes. You know, some of you might have your wastewater engineers, some of you might have, you know, your civil engineers. They might say, well, you know, your timeframes are your problem, not mine. And also we're seeing COVID absences everywhere as well. So do keep that in mind, that that's an option. And it is an option for your panel as well. So if you explain it to them, you know, go back to 102(3)(c), it's very, very clearly there, that head of power. Deferrals as well. So I think keeping your panel informed in particular about how much of the clock is left on an assessment is entirely important. Deferrals are best avoided, but if there is time, You know, there's nothing wrong, I guess, with a decision being deferred, particularly if we get the applicant that goes at the very last minute. The planning officers have been telling me this all throughout my 70 business day assessment period, but panel, I'll give you what you want. You know, be very conscious of timeframes and make sure that discussion is had with them, and that, you know, a lot of council and RAP reports are now actually putting the assessment period and how many days are left on the clock as a bit of a reminder in the agenda papers as well. Very, very helpful.
But just on that, the deferral doesn't count as like the panel from it, you know.
No. You can ask the applicant to volunteer to put their application on hold, but there's no ability for the relevant authority to extend time. If there's a variation and it's substantial, it resets. But if the panel says to an applicant, "Oh, look, come back, give us new plans, we want to defer," if time's running out, the applicant could act in bad faith and get a deemed consent. And again, you might be successful in getting that overturned, but it's not worth the money. Some ways of dealing with it. If you're running short on time, it is possible for a panel to resolve to authorise the assessment manager to either grant consent or refuse a development application at day zero or when the information is provided. So that's a way of them making a decision, not having to go back to the panel, but at the same time allowing the assessment manager to issue the refusal if that's needed. There's ways and means of dealing with it, but again, it's important to keep that under consideration. Conditions, I think my comment on that is the rules about conditions remain. So we do have our deemed consent conditions that are imposed through a practice direction, but outside of that context, the practice direction, what it does helpfully is it just reiterates the case law rules that have evolved over many, many decades when it comes to conditions. I think though, keep in mind when you're dealing with conditions that require things to happen after the fact, do keep it in mind, should it be a condition or a reserve matter? How far is the condition going? And if you're starting to have conditions that say this has to occur before development approval, again, consider whether that could be better handled through a reserve matter. And simply on conditions as well, the ERD court is treating conditions on planning consents under the PDI Act very much the same as they did under the Development Act. So they want to see precision, they want to see certainty. If you're referring to plans and details, they want to see the plans and details named. They like plain English, so they want anyone to be able to pick up the condition and understand what they need to do, when and how. To the reasonable satisfaction, do remember that the authority that will be enforcing those conditions is not the assessment manager or the panel. So if we're talking about landscaping, maintaining in good health at all times to the reasonable satisfaction of, that should probably be the council, because it'll be the council issuing the enforcement notice through its delegates if it's not happy with how landscaping is maintained. So make sure that your wording fits, because there might be some instances where to the reasonable satisfaction of might need to be a different entity other than the council. How are we going for time? Not bad. Okay, so couple of closing remarks. So reviews. We've got two types of reviews, as everyone would be familiar with. So what a review is as a matter of law, a review is not actually opening up all the merits of a decision again and considering everything afresh. It's just looking plainly and simply at what decision was made on what documentation, and on that documentation, was the decision correct, yes or no? So this is really important in the context of panel reviews of assessment manager decisions, because there have been some cases where an application has been refused for a want of information by the assessment manager, and the review has come into the panel, and the panel can review that, but the review application has asked for the panel to grant a planning consent. The ERD court's rules apply, I think, with what the ERD court has determined when there's been similar attempts made where there's been an early refusal for a procedural step. The ERD court says we are a review body. We can't review a decision that's not been made yet. So if an applicant does want to go down the panel review path for a refusal before there's been the final decision made on the merits of an application, the panel doesn't have the jurisdiction to actually go further than the original decision maker made. Another point on that as well is we've seen some review applications come in where, yes, the decision's been made by the assessment manager or a delegate, but the relevant authority is actually the panel. So legally, whilst the panel delegates down for verification, referrals, notification, all the procedural steps for a performance assessed publicly notified development application, the decision maker is still the panel. So the review function under section 203 of the PDI Act is for the assessment manager as relevant authority for the panel to review their decision. So therefore it's not possible for the panel to review a decision made by one of its delegates, because that law, the decision is the panel's decision, and if the panel doesn't like how their delegates are making their decision, well, the panel has to look at its delegations and review them and replace them. The old neighbour reviews are still there. Unsurprisingly, they're far less frequent now. And I think what is really becoming apparent to adjacent landowners and occupiers is they're not going to get appeal rights. The number of restricted developments are so few that even if these reviews are being initiated, applicants are generally accepting that they're not going to really get what they want, which is to get this development application fully and finally refused. We have seen some interesting situations where reviews have been put in place under old Legacy Development Act decisions, and then what the applicant does, review the code and go, oh, I'm going to lodge the same application under the PDI Act because my neighbour will never get appeal rights. And there's actually no statutory rule that says you can't lodge multiple applications for the same development. That's quite lawful. So that is a strategy that's being put into place quite commonly. Also as well, because there's no rule requiring variations to old Category 3 approvals to be publicly notified, a lot of people are now lodging variations to old Category 3 approvals, knowing that there might be no public notification whatsoever, or that if there is public notification, it's not going to lead to appeal rights. There's no transitional provisions under the PDI Act that requires full Category 3 notification for those applications again. Very, very quickly, for development approvals, the relevant authority for development approvals is going to be the council, so that remains the same. Councils need to have delegations in place to make sure that the final development approval can be issued. Consistency checks are still required, and there is still a lot of arguments about what's inconsistent, what's not, what's approved, what's not. And we do have, I guess, two different streams of case law authorities about that. So the rules of engagement are, if a consent is so deficient in terms of the information required or clear error of law, so if something was approved as deemed to satisfy for a planning consent but it clearly wasn't, then the ERD court has held at the point of development approval that planning consent is not a decision. And if the relevant authority at that point, the council decides, well, we're not going to issue a development approval, there's case law to say, well, if there's a clear procedural defect, we're going to say that there was no approval in the first place. However, where a relevant authority has made a value judgment, an opinion judgment, and they've said, for instance, in the building sphere, I think this building is class 10A, and that's my professional opinion, and the relevant authority for development approval disagrees, it's a professional opinion that can't be interfered with. So that's the line. Where this becomes a bit tricky is when is one or more of the minor variations a minor variation? Because there's an element of opinion, but there's also an element of procedural error there too. We've got some cases in the residential context. I think the case law has wound up on, if we're looking at the old Resi Code, if you're starting to go 400 mils beyond a numerical requirement, particularly if we're dealing with setbacks, boundary walls, things like that, that's a step too far. But minor can mean different things in different contexts, and this is really important given that DTS criteria is far wider under the Planning and Design Code than it ever was under the Development Regs. So if you're looking at things like there's DTS industrial buildings in some zones, what is and isn't a minor variation is going to change. And I think the main criteria is going to be, when you're looking at non-residential development, it's less numerical and it's going to be more about impacts. Obviously there is an upper limit for numerical minor variations. They still have to be minor, but when we're dealing with things that aren't going to be perceived outside of the site, where it's a variation that, you know, from a less numerical criteria, for instance, where it's an amenity impact, that is going to, there is a lot more leniency there than 400 mil. Land vision, still the same. We're getting some interesting questions with combined DAs now about what is cleared when. You need to think very, very carefully about staging. Inspections as well. Unsurprisingly, the increased rate of mandatory inspections for building work is resulting in greater numbers of compliance issues being identified, and the inspection burden doesn't look like it's going to ease up anytime soon. One thing I want just to point out quickly for conditions as well is that, given we're about to go back to, we've flipped back and forth a few times, certificates of occupancy for Class 1 developments, so detached dwellings, your small-scale residential developments. Certificates of occupancy do require conditions that say that something must be done before occupancy to be fulfilled before a certificate of occupancy is granted. So if you're looking at Class 1 residential developments, things like, you know, screening treatments to balconies, upper floor windows, those sorts of things that should be in place before occupancy, they can feed through when those requirements are back to mean that the certificate of occupancy can't be granted until they're fulfilled. So keep that in mind when you're granting planning conditions. Essential safety provisions as well, they're a big flashpoint at the moment, and there is the ability as well, they come in more in the building side to put conditions on requiring certain ESPs, even if they are required to be a Form 2 or Form 3 requirement to be linked to conditions as well. I'll touch on really quickly compliance and enforcement. Do remember, so the Act, and this is just needlessly complex, but most authorities have gone to 4 sets of delegations. You can get away with it in 3, but you've got your panel as a relevant authority, you've got your assessment manager as relevant authority. Councils are still a relevant authority for building consents, development approvals, certificates of occupancy. But also you've got this concept of a designated authority, and that relates mostly to land management agreements, enforcement, compliance. So I mentioned the point before, if you're looking at putting planning conditions on, something needs to be maintained to the satisfaction of somebody, put it back to the council, because it's only the council as a designated authority that's got the ability to enforce. On the offence provisions, the implications for breaching the PDI Act have become considerably more broader and more onerous than what was available under the Development Act. And what's happened is essentially the remedies available under the Environment Protection Act have been transported into the PDI Act. So if somebody is found guilty of an offence under the PDI Act, the old penalty for undertaking development without approval, maximum fine of $120,000 still applies. But if they're a corporation, it's 5 times that. So it goes up to $600,000 maximum fine. If a person who breached the Act received an economic benefit, if you can quantify the amount of economic benefit that was achieved through breaching of the Act, the ERD court can order that they pay that amount. There's orders for compensation available. There's also adverse publicity orders, where if somebody is convicted of an offence, the ERD court can make them publish details of that offence. And this is what you see in the Advertiser from time to time, where there's a full-page ad because somebody contaminated a waterway when they shouldn't have. It's that type of remedy. So I think one of the gaps in the old Development Act was corporate offenders building the potential for fines into the cost of business, because let's face it, a criminal conviction for a company can be get around really easily. So we now have a lot more tools in the toolbox, particularly if you're writing to companies and saying, look, you've got to get this sorted out because this is what we can pursue if we take this further. Do remember though, community expectations about breaches are high. Everyone's been locked up for 2 years and they're all complaining about each other. The designated authority always has the discretion whether they enforce a breach of the Act or not. So you're not compelled, no matter how heinous the offence was, to actually do anything about it. It's a discretion. And provided that there's good reasons for the exercise of discretion, that's all that needs to be done. So more and more authorities are getting out enforcement policies, explaining to the public that we might not prosecute your neighbour just because they put up an outbuilding without approval. There's a process that we go through, and this is why. That's a really, really handy tool to have. And especially recognising that the evidentiary burden for prosecutions, it's the same regardless of whether you've murdered someone or whether you cut down a tree. All elements of the offence have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. That is such a high threshold that it is, in a lot of cases, prosecution, albeit desired, might not happen because the evidentiary burden can't be met. So, but your average complainant might not understand that. So again, getting some enforcement policies up is a good idea. Getting into governance. A few points to keep in mind. Panels. So I did mention earlier on, and there is a bit of crossover into this session in case you're worried about your governance point. I can confirm it is part of the 3 hours, even though we've gone a little bit over. It is possible to have more than one panel in any council area. And in fact, and this is on the public record, there was a Metropolitan Council that resolved recently to establish a second council assessment panel to be dedicated to dealing with heritage matters. The panel was going to be a 3-member panel. And what Section 83 of the PDI Act allows to occur is actually multiple panels, with each having their own classes of development as specified by the body that creates them. The second panel, that motion was rescinded, I think, as it became clear about the implications of one council operating more than one panel. Because each panel has its own assessment manager, so there have to be a second assessment manager. Also, the portal's not built for more than one panel. But some interesting questions came up. You know, it was a reactive decision to react to a particular development application lodged in a heritage area, but the application had already been verified by the time the second panel was established. So the relevant authority had already been determined through the verification process. It couldn't be changed. And I'm mentioning this because there's a few of you here in areas where your elected body might want a second panel. It's not a quick fix. Also, I'm very concerned about the fact that the portal needs to be changed to add a second panel. And what needs to be kept in mind under Section 84 and Section 86 of the Act, if there's some concern by the State Planning Commission that the development assessment performance of a relevant authority is not in compliance with the PDI Act, the State Planning Commission can investigate that. And if they make adverse findings, the Minister for Planning of the day can wipe out every panel that a council has established and replace it with a local assessment panel, where the Minister chooses the members, the CE of the department, whoever's the department is at the time, because it's changed about six times in the past 6 months. But the CE then chooses who the assessment manager is. And all of the costs, expenses and liabilities of the local assessment panel are borne by the council. So the council gets a decision maker appointed for them, 2 decision makers, and they pick up the bill. So that mechanism was very John Rao, former Minister for Planning. It's him all over, and I think I'm thankful to my state government friends for laughing at that joke. It was. I mean, the problem was councils, and we want to make sure that councils don't stack their panels in a particular way to make particular decisions which are contrary to our new uniform consistent planning system. So the lever to make sure that doesn't happen is the constitution of a local assessment panel, and it's there. Whether it's ever exercised or not remains to be seen, but that needs to be considered whenever there's a move to establish more than one panel, because it has happened, and I have no doubt it will happen again in the future, probably in the lead up to the November elections, no doubt. The assessment manager as well, do keep in mind if you are appointed to that role, they have a dual function. So duties to the panel, make sure the panel has proper assessment reports, has the proper information that they need, the proper advice. And I think that the role of the assessment manager needs to be part of the meeting procedures. So the assessment manager should be the conduit to additional information, late information, coordinating with the presiding member about special meetings Do we have people online? Do we allow that to occur? Do they not? Because under Section 87 of the Act, they have a statutory responsibility to make sure that the panel is operating well, smoothly, and can make decisions as they're required to do. And that is separate to their role as a relevant authority. With the PDI Act and the PDI General Regulations, I mentioned this before, you know, it does use this dual concept of accredited professionals as being, you know, you need to be accredited to be appointed or you are operating in that realm. But the PDI accredited professionals regulations uses it in the one context that you're accredited and therefore you're duty bound to comply with the regulations. So do keep in mind if you are accredited, you need to be very familiar with the accredited professionals regulations, because if there is ever a question about your conduct and whether you're complying with them, the decision made is going to be personally, of effect rather than affecting your employer. I've mentioned the council and retaining some role under the PDI Act, and this is really a question for those of you that are responsible for maintaining delegations, to be very, very careful that your delegations are up to date. We went through a period where I think the PDI general regulations changed almost every week, you know, for quite a number of weeks there. And there were changes, most recently just before Christmas, to certificate of occupancy requirements. So that meant assessment manager, assessment panel delegations were okay, but all the council delegations needed updating almost immediately. And whilst there are now through the LGA the Reliances delegation system, they don't always follow through with, you know, the timing, because we don't always get told about legislative changes before they happen. So do be very careful as well, getting around your saving provisions, your transitional provisions about when decisions need to be made under particular provisions of the Act. And I think for your governance officers, for those of you in councils, it is a constant monitoring process. There needs to be a weekly review of the Gazette, and there needs to be constantly looking at it. Every Thursday around 3 p.m. it comes out. Whilst it's slowed down for the moment, as I said, it was changing every week there for quite some months, and in a way where you could start having decisions made under the old regs, because those changes were coming through, and quite often it was 25 provisions being changed all at once. And I mentioned there, of course, about the role of accredited professionals as relevant authorities. I think one thing just to reiterate, if you are accredited professional making DTS decisions, you can't delegate your functions and powers under any circumstances. So the intent of Parliament there is to say, if you're operating privately, you're making statutory decisions, they are your decisions and your decisions only. You are personally liable and personally responsible for them. And if you do have a structure where you do employ people to help you with them, you are ultimately responsible to review their work and make sure it's entirely correct, because that's not their decision, it's yours. I mentioned the miasma of delegations before. Generally, the recommended structure is that your panel is delegating first to the assessment manager, recognising that the assessment manager is usually in a team leader or management role. So then the assessment manager is free to subdelegate, particular powers to particular people in accordance with the team structure. We don't know of any panels that have gone rogue and have decided to delegate to whoever they want to. It is possible. But I think, you know, if that ever were to happen, you'd want your elected body looking at the terms of reference for the panel pretty quickly to manage that issue. When it comes to the assessment manager, of course, there's a suite of delegations for them, and they can delegate as they see fit to members in their team. If there is a question about who they're delegating to and it's not right or it's not considered consistent with the organisation, employment-wise, they report to the CEO. So there's that ability to fix that issue there if it arises. From the council, so the council has its own delegations. It's the traditional format through the CEO, sub-delegated to particular officers. Because of the rate of change of delegations, I think it's important to note, if you're the assessment manager, you've got your delegations, there's no actual formal process for adopting them. You just need a suite of delegations, you sign off on them and you date them. That's enough. But if we're looking at the panel or the council, you do need a resolution. If you are managing delegations, you don't actually need to revoke and replace your delegations every time. You can just insert new ones or change them, but quite often it's just easier to do a full revocation and replacement. And I did mention Regulation 30 before as well, in terms of situations where you might have to delegate your functions and powers to avoid offending that. I mentioned all of this before. We skipped ahead. So, functus officio, I think just what it is, you know, we evolved a system of property law in our legal system, which we've inherited from, you know, countries that are much older than Australia, where, you know, you hear the saying, a man's home is his castle. And I don't know whether the gender neutral format of that works as well, but the idea was when you had title to land, that was it. You do with your land what you do. Town planning has restricted those rights, and necessarily, because we live in a society and we need to make sure that our society is functioning well. But what that means is that, you know, when an applicant gets a decision, they're owed certainty. The relevant authority is not allowed to go, you know what, we gave you your planning consent 2 weeks ago, but we've changed our mind. That's why that certainty is there. It's recognising those property law rights. And again, it's a question, this one comes up, you know, okay, you've got a defect in the decision. Sometimes you have to accept that decision's been granted. We've had instances with RAPs where someone's made a decision at one of the member councils and they didn't have a delegation to do that. The decision stands. You know, there's nothing much you can do about it apart from, if there is an oversight body complaint, to be ready to answer for it. But I think as well the challenge is going to be, and it is, in communicating with the community about that. If you have a community member that identifies a defect in a decision, it could quickly become part of a conspiracy. It could reflect badly on your team. And again, there's always a difference between the legal position and community expectations when it comes to planning decisions. And I don't think that tension will ever be resolved, no matter how good our system is. Some current key governance issues. I think this goes back to deemed consents resourcing. I think a lot of organisations thought that the advent of the PDI Act and how it was sold would mean that no one would need planners anymore. And it's the opposite. That's entirely true. So a lot of teams were caught out with not having enough resources. I don't think anyone could have predicted the pandemic, but two, the massive uplift in development applications that resulted, with the intent of the PDI Act to move more into DTS with more certification available for people. So that's caught a lot of people by surprise, and we're seeing a lot of deemed consents as a result. But I think over the longer term, I think the trends are that organisations are going to have to accept that they need more planners, and if they can't afford to employ planners, they're going to have to use consultants more and more. And you know, we've got our big consultancy firms. There's two really big ones, and there's one that's trying to catch up. And you know, you can see how much they're growing off of this as well. And a lot of them are now establishing local government teams to do consulting work straight back into councils. Portal use and familiarity. This has been a challenge for a lot of people, because the portal, it's evolving. You know, it needs a lot of testing. There's areas of refinement, but a lot of people have been struggling with using the portal. So thankfully, from a decision-making point of view, people are catching up and they're getting familiar with the portal. Those who, you know, are not very IT savvy are catching up, and they've got the support of their teams and colleagues. But applicants are finding it really difficult in a lot of respects, and you know, I think it's not an option for everybody to get a consultant to help you with a development application. But as is everything, you know, the disappointment that's usually expressed at that relevant authority level and not higher up. But I don't think there's an answer to that. I think the trade-off for having a portal and having everything centralised, higher quality of development applications, is that they naturally become more expensive because people need professional assistance with plans, with drafting and with lodging. Referral agencies aren't sticking to timeframes very well, and this is putting people... Maria, yeah, well, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but it's hard because resourcing is an issue, okay? So it's putting relevant authorities in really, really difficult positions, because if you're, you know, waiting back for a very technical referral, you know, it could be landscape protection, it could be native veg, it could be CFS, it could be EPA. and that time passes, well, you know, the regs actually provide it means that they don't want to make a comment. And I think there needs to be some looking at referral agencies. I think, you know, as well as awareness about the statutory time limits, maybe give them a hold point at some circumstances, because at the moment they're relying upon requests for further information to do that. But if they don't have a request, you know, that can be appealed and they can go through. We're also seeing referral agencies that don't want to issue a direction because they know that if they do and there's an appeal, they'll be the person arguing the appeal. So what they're doing is they're trying to negotiate with an applicant, but time runs on. So that's throwing up some really, you know, difficult questions for relevant authorities, because if there is a deemed consent, the referral agency isn't a party to the legal proceedings to overturn the deemed consent. So there's a tension there, and I think it would be helpful if there was some statutory criteria where a referral agency outside of an RFI could extend time. And I think particularly COVID's not going away due to staff absences, resourcing deficiencies, even if it's just for 30 days, but something where they can tick where it's not going to become a problem for the relevant authority to deal with.
Is this like a problem of, we talked about yesterday about we try to run like 2 assessment processes in parallel. We use the code to do that, like with DTS and DPFs, and, you know, for deemed to satisfy pathways or performance success pathways. And a lot of the legislation is about kind of stuff that's kind of simple in DTS, and whereas performance assessed, you know, referrals are about complex things. Because the standard response of, well, you don't want referrals was always, well, you just refuse stuff. Because a referral is about an enabling thing. So it's enabling, it's about negotiation, but statutory stuff is just not kind of, from a governance perspective, it's geared, it's trying to run a 2-speed system as well in legislation, but it's not as adaptable to the realities of complex applications that are going through a performance assess process. And maybe for referral agencies, the habit has been with relevant authorities to just let them roll on and not say, well, bugger, you know, your time's up, stuff you, and even if you come in a day later, it's too bad, so sad. Like, but you know, which, because you do that, it's a bit like, you know, giving your children kind of limits and boundaries and stuff like that. But
You said it, not me.
The legislation has a problem with trying to navigate two speeds, 2 different systems at the same time.
It does, and you know, we've got some matters on where the role of the referral bodies is being brought into question. So we've got situations where the referral agency has said, well, no, this can be approved, we don't have a problem with it, but there's representatives that disagree. So this is coming up a lot in heritage matters, and it's disputes between Heritage SA and representatives that say, I've lived here my whole life and this has got heritage significance. And there's a recognition legally that referral agencies don't actually assess against the code. So whilst the DOs bring the referral agencies into play, they've got their own remit under their own legislation, and that informs their assessment. But it's the role of the relevant authority to take that advice. So unless there's a direction and it's just advice given, you've got to take that and translate it into what the code is calling for. And so it is actually possible legally for a relevant authority to depart from an agency's advice where they haven't made a direction, but the circumstances under which you do that are very, very limited. So you can, so that you give them significant weight in your assessment, where you can link it to the DPF criteria and POs. Sorry, I should say POs primarily. But yeah, that's recognised amongst the legal fraternity as well. And I think we are going to start to see some judgments from the ERD court where the referral agency's taken very strict views. The relevant authority hasn't wanted to depart from that, but the applicant's saying there's good reason to. And it'll be interesting to see what the legislative response to that as well, because the intent is that the referral agencies get their say before there's ever a development authorisation issued. So it prevents them having activities going on which are within their remit which they don't know about. And I think the main thing is on this slide that I wanted to mention is just keeping consistency in place. So the portal is helping with the consistency of decisions and record management and record keeping. So that, again, I see as a very positive thing. But just to make sure, again, that with your agenda reports, they are going up consistently, and also things like, you know, template conditions, using the same wording, looking at the way that you describe developments, albeit within the constraints of the portal. Because that's really important, because if somebody's trying to nitpick a decision, these are the types of things that they'll look for. Some current cases that are going through. I mentioned joinders before, so we are seeing people get joined to appeals when they know that CAPs are about to settle. They're turning up to CAP meetings. One of the great things about the pandemic, we're all online, and a lot of CAP meetings are being streamed. The downside is more and more people can see them. So we're seeing a lot more, you know, attempts to get in to appeals and try and get them resolved, you know, try and frustrate resolutions and settlements and to run arguments about refusal even though a person didn't have appeal rights. Seriously at variance is in play as well. So under the PDI Act, there's been a change of wording. So the PDI Act emphasises that the decision about whether a development is seriously at variance or not is an opinion judgment made by the relevant authority. This is really important because to challenge an opinion, you can only really do so if it's so unreasonable that no reasonable decision maker could have reached the same opinion on the same facts. That is a really high threshold. And in Cabaz and the State Planning Commission, it was that very question examined on judicial review by a single judge of the Supreme Court, and the judge said, well, seriously at variance is not a merits question. It's not about the degrees of compliance with the code. It's really, again, an initial look at this, look at the zone it's in. It'll never ever be worthy of approval at that very initial review. That's gone to the Court of Appeal, so we expect, given who's on the court at the moment, that that's probably going to be upheld. But this is really, really important because we're seeing judicial reviews coming in about some of the zones that haven't quite achieved what was hoped to be achieved. So a big one at the moment is the rural zone. You've got rural zones, you've got tourism development zones. Tourism development zones are specifically for very, very large tourism developments, but rural zones talk about tourism developments on a smaller scale. So when you've got land where there's a big tourism development proposed, say in a rural zone, the land doesn't have productive agricultural value, perfect for tourism accommodation, a DA comes in. Is it seriously at variance or not? And a lot of relevant authorities have said, well, no, because it's tourism development, how big it is a merits question. But then you start to get commercial competitors that go, hey, I got my land rezoned for this very purpose and I want to challenge yours because you're not in the right zone for it. And it seems to be that, look, if a zone envisages something, that's the threshold test. You know, seriously at variance is so seriously at variance, it could never ever, in your opinion, warrant approval. But that's where we're seeing a lot of judicial reviews and case law action at the moment. Some other issues of note. I've talked about how many variations we have to the regulations and how frequently, and the need to get a Gazette monitor going if you don't have it. So the Government Gazette website is freely accessible, and they generally are published on a Thursday around 3 p.m. You can have special gazettes, but they're usually on really limited things like COVID rule changes and the like. If there are changes to the planning and design code that go through as minor variations to the code, which happen weekly, they will tend to be gazetted on a Thursday, as will changes to the regs. But I can't stress enough, you've got to keep a watching brief on them until the planning system matures, where it's stabilised, and we get to the point where we got under the Development Act and regs where changes, we knew they were coming. They were planned for a long time and they were shared and they were talked about and consulted on. Some interesting developments. Councils are putting in representations on performance assessed, publicly notified development applications. Under the Development Act, they were prohibited from doing so because they were the relevant authority. They were forced to delegate through Section 3423 of the Development Act to staff and to the panel. And then Section 3424 actually said, well, you can't express an opinion, you can't influence, you can't try and make sure that your employees are doing your bidding. But that's all disappeared under the PDI Act. So there's no prohibition from a council putting in a representation on a development application that's before their own relevant authority that they've appointed. That's happening a lot. There's elections coming in November, and so, there was one, it was publicised in the Advertiser, there's an OTR proposed at Heathfield within the Adelaide Hills Council area. Lots of community objection, and the Adelaide Hills Council has put in a representation. Nothing to stop that from happening, but I think the answer if you're dealing with elected members is, well, there's no prohibition, but obviously that needs to be really carefully managed because you're dealing with officers within the same organisation. I think thankfully representations are happening quite early on because of the time frame. So if there are legitimate concerns with a development application, then quite often there's variations that need to be addressed and that are identified early on, and then it's going back through re-notification again.
I wonder whether or not, I think that's a completely legitimate reason. We've said that elected members can't be involved in the planning system as decision makers other than the one representative on a panel. So I think it's entirely reasonable then to say that they can do that. But I wonder, and I think of in the context of in the private sector, like, I work for a big firm, so I might be working client side and the rest of the business is working applicant side, kind of stuff, that sense of probity and the importance of, maybe it's your governance team or it's your community team or whatever it is, and there's this kind of a firewall that we would talk about.
You need firewalls, and
kind of thing internally to deal with that.
Absolutely, and it needs to be made very clear that, because what a lot of elected members are not understanding is that when notification happens, there's no view on the development application at that point. So it could be many weeks or months before the application's actually put to the panel. So they can't assume just because a development application's been notified that it will be approved, because that's a bit of a misunderstanding that's arisen in some chambers. They go, oh, yeah, it's going to happen. Well, no, it might not. But you can put your representation in, but that doesn't mean, just because it's out there, doesn't mean it's going to get approved. You need to put, the relevant authorities are those specified by the PDI Act. Yes, you're paying for their activities and you're funding them, and they're your organisation staff and people you appoint, but they're not you. You are two separate decision makers. Also, it is a bit, it needs to be kept separate. I think kept with the governance stuff, kept far away from the DA team, because workplace management as well. You don't want people feeling bullied and harassed because of the way that reps are coming in. And managing elected members is really important. They don't get to talk to the planning staff. They don't get to walk up and say, I'm going to put in my representation. I want to talk to you about this. I know. But I think this is going to be an expanding area as more and more councils become live to the fact that they can have their say on a planning application. So I think as well, something else that's happened, this is related to the second cap issue that I mentioned before, was a desire for the council to want to support joinder applicants who want to join a planning appeal against the panel decision, and whether the council could join as a party to that appeal to actually argue for a refusal where their panel is determined to settle the appeal. And when you look at, but also when you look at, what the PDI Act says, and it has very limited detail about appointing your CAP. It goes back to the objects of the Act and the role that the CAP plays under the PDI Act, which is to make decisions under the PDI Act with regard to the provisions of the Planning and Design Code. So if your panel is operating in that way and your individual members are operating consistently with that objective, you don't have grounds, no matter what's in your terms of reference, to remove them. And I'd suggest if the terms of reference, Renee, were changed to require your elected member to represent the community, that's a problem in of itself. And that's maladministration in of itself.
But then they also wanted to make the CAP to record, like it does council meetings. And then they learned that they can't make the CAP do that. The CAP can make its own decisions. So we've just had, actually Thursday night next week, we're considering confidence whether the CAP's going to record its decisions. And the reason that they asked for that to happen is basically so that members of the public can find where fault is
Yeah.
and use that to appeal CAP decisions.
And no doubt you've got the advice on that, but CAP decisions are by consensus. They're not subject to the local government procedures at meetings, regulations. They are, and the Act and the regs do make this clear. It's a consensus-based decision-making body, and you don't call for divisions. You don't record who's made a decision a particular way, because the CAP is the relevant authority, and its remit is to weigh up all the facts and circumstances and to make a merits-based decision. So you don't record who's made what decision. You might get a circumstance, and I've had this recently, where an elected member has wanted to say, the one on the CAP, I voted against this, even though, but for political reasons. Okay, if you want to record your vote, you can ask for the leave of the meeting, and that can be minuted, but you don't vote. You don't record who's voted in a particular way, and that applied. That was an issue under the Development Act, where when elected members became in the minority and they weren't happy with how the independent members were operating. Well, we want to record what they're voting on to show that they've got bias towards particular DAs or against particular DAs. So, yeah, it's all happening. Look, every 4 years we get this. It'll calm down, hopefully, towards the end of next year when they're all settled in. But, yeah, it's a question that comes up time and time again. But I think given the new structure of the Act, councils are cottoning on to the fact that, we can have a bit more participation in these matters. But the misunderstanding, I think, is in how much influence they can have, how involved they can get. And if they start funding things and having a bob each way, I think they venture into maladministration.
Well, and that's where the Minister will take a hell of a lot of interest. And that's where we were heading.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, and that's where I was sort of hoping it would end up, that it would pique the Minister's interest very quickly.
New Minister settling in. But yeah, look, it's a really interesting space at the moment, and I don't know whether anyone's going to be brave enough to pull that lever, to be honest. And I think it's a shame that I know why, and it's resourcing, but it's also there's other matters involved as well. But the RAP model is working really well, I think, generally, because it's taken the politics completely out of planning decisions. So, the amount of RAPs, because of the accreditation requirements for panel members, RAPs became an inevitability outside of Metro Adelaide. The EP RAP flies everyone in from Adelaide, and it works really, really well. I mean, Kayla's involved, doing some work for District Council of Lower Eyre Peninsula. I think the elected members, and rocket launch sites are very controversial out in these areas. But, there's, I think having that removal, and even just in the name, because they don't have a council name anymore, there seems to be psychologically an acceptance that they're not related to us, which is the attitude adjustment is fantastic to deal with.
It's independent, It's like they're not going back to council. They've had lunch together and they made their deals behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Now the applicant thinks it's separate.
Yeah, and so I think we might see some metro RAPs coming into place, but I think because of the resourcing that you have available to you, you don't have the same pressures to go and get those governance models set up. But just simple changes, like we've got a 2-council RAP for Yankalilla and Alexandrina, but it's called the Flurio RAP. So even though it's just 2 councils, again, they go, oh, well, it's not us. It doesn't have our name on it, so we've got to accept that they're the independent umpire. So
do you think there's better decisions coming out of RAPs as well?
Not really, no.
Consistent, I should say.
No, because you're still dealing with, and there's exceptions to the rules, like our mate Billo is presiding member of a CAP, and but most CAP members are planners. There's a few exceptions, a few architects, a few lawyers, a few this and that, but it's still the same case that if you've got a panel of professionals who've got to express an opinion, they're going to have their opinions, they're going to have their likes and dislikes, and so panel decisions are. I think there's kind of a consistency in that they can be unpredictable at times, and they can go against recommendations.
Being on a panel, it makes it really interesting because, of course, if we refuse something that has gone against recommendation of staff, we don't have budgets. you know, the council is funding an appeal and that process. So there's a really interesting kind of governance question.
There's another question that's come up. Is can the council turn off the tap for legal funding if the panel is backing unwinnable appeals? And that's an interesting question, because all Section 83 says is that the costs and liabilities of the panel are borne by the council. So there's kind of an interpretation there to say, well, you don't have a choice. If the panel generates costs and expenses, you just have to pay for it. But some councils are saying no. We might think about turning off the tap.
With respect to what? Because as a bare minimum, you have to respect the court process and defend the decision.
Yeah, I think it's come up where there's been judicial reviews, and so you've got the applicant for review, and then you've got the developer involved.
So those two find it out.
Yeah, yeah.
The decision.
And you're abiding the event, and you know, and that option is to exit. But I think what can't, yeah.
There's still an obligation on.
There isn't an obligation to defend decisions, because if you don't defend a decision, I think it's implicit in that action that your decision was crap and should never have been made in the first
There's
place.
not an obligation to present planning evidence and support.
Do you know what I
There's been
can?
a number of appeals where the council hasn't presented planning.
Oh, Don, and you know how they end. I ran one once, and it was just, yeah, it was not a good experience. Because it's a merits it's a merits appeal jurisdiction. If you don't have expert evidence to present to the court, you could have Brian Hayes QC roll up, and the commissioner will say, well, you're criticising the opposing side's evidence, but where's yours? Because my role is to consider everything put before me, and to consider not only on the original decision but on this new evidence who's got the stronger case, and you don't have a case. Apart from attacking the other witness. But where's your opposing expert evidence to show me?
Well, you talked about the importance of words, and that's something we certainly crafted, or had crafted for council last year with respect to defending a matter in court. And it was, you know, the wording was around, you know, shall participate to the extent necessary to, you know, respect the court. There's not. And then on a flip side, it was a vigorous defence shall be, you know, employed. So they're trying to get involved where they can to make sure that you know, we are funding or not funding, you know, to a degree. Obviously, we, you know, as staff will try and give our best professional opinions as to, you know, the merits of that, or put our foot down when we think it's gone too far. But,
As a bare minimum, it should be at least the planner making the decision that gets up in front of the court.
And the other questions that's come up is where a decision is just held on to beyond reason and no one can support it, but the panel wants to bat on, or the decision maker wants to bat on, but the administration advice is you're not going to win.
And,
you know.
and I think this is really interesting, because I think about, you know, past kind of things. How do you do that, and where does that put a panel? And from a governance or a legal perspective, is saying, okay, well, maybe then that's the call. You've got independent members, and you're, you know, experts. Maybe it's the presiding member that has to go and front up to the court. But then, you know, how do you?
But then the presiding member isn't the panel.
The presiding member is not the panel, but you know, so it's really interesting how some of that kind of nuance, kind of detail, kind of stuff plays out in.
So what's the legality now, what they've been saying? Say they go to court, the applicant wins against council, and then the applicant says, well, I've got costs that need to be taken out of this. Do they sue the assessment manager, or
No.
the professional?
No, because the ERD court for appeals is a no-cost jurisdiction. So to get costs,
By agreement.
no, not even in agreement in an appeal. I mean, if someone's made a negligent decision, that's different. You could sue them for compensation. But if you've exercised an appeal right and the appeal body sides with you, under the ERD court rules, there's no cost unless someone's behaviour is so terrible that costs are warranted. So there was an example of that recently. There's a case, it's a judgment, I suggest you read it. It's called Scragg and the City of Port Adelaide Enfield No. 2. And what happened was Mr. Scragg got a refusal for a development application under the Development Act.
Is this the famous Roy Scragg?
No, it's his son.
In the family.
It's Peter. It's Peter Scragg. But anyway, look. It's important to. I recommend you read it because it was the first instance where a losing relevant authority got a cost order. So what had happened was Mr. Scragg won his appeal against a refusal of. It was a delegated decision, but it was the council to refuse his application for a house in a residential zone. But because of his bad behaviour, he got a cost order against him. And what he had done was, Warwick's laughing, I'm sorry. But, what had happened, and it's all in the judgment, was the matter was listed for hearing, and he was required to produce his final set of plans, because things kept changing, right? And then he didn't do that, and so the council applied for an adjournment of the hearing and said, well, hang on, the court told you to do this, you didn't do this, we gave you so many opportunities to do this, we've left it until the very last point where we'll have to get onto the experts, we don't want to spend money unnecessarily, so we want to go to court, we want to have the hearing adjourned. He refused to consent to an adjournment, so the adjournment was granted and the council asked that costs be reserved, because there is a ground under section 29 of the ERD court where an adjournment is necessary because of the conduct of a party, the other party gets costs. Then the appeal was listed for hearing again, and a final suite of plans was produced, expert reports were exchanged, albeit late, and then there was a site view and court resumed at just before lunch, and it became very apparent all of a sudden that the plans had changed. And the plans that were produced, they weren't produced to the council, they weren't produced to the court, they were there in person. They addressed every single reason for refusal, which was then discussed at length during the conference phase. And so what happened then? There was 3 expert reports on the behalf of the council, useless. The appellant was allowed to present his case, but then the hearing had to be adjourned. So what was meant to be a 2-day hearing was then extended to 4 days. There was a gap because the experts had to go back and revise their reports. And we had the appeal and the refusal was overturned. But had those changes happened at the very beginning, there would never have been a refusal in the first instance, but human behaviour. And so what happened then is a cost order was pursued on the basis that the relevant authority had the cost of the first adjournment, but on the second adjournment there was cost thrown away because the experts had to redo their reports. There was legal fees. We prepare on the basis that each day in court you've got a day's prep for a day's in court. I mean, we might spend more time, but that's how we charge you because it's on us if we need more than a day to prepare for more than a day. But, there was a lot of cost thrown away. So the cost application was pursued and that was resisted. And so the council actually got the cost of seeking costs on top of its costs. And that's pursuing through the formal processes because what the court did was made an order, and they made an order for the costs of all of this wasted time plus the cost application on a basis called solicitor-client. So normally a normal costs order, if you are in a cost jurisdiction, is you get party costs, which are the costs that you've spent directly on court, not advice, not emails, not anything else that's kind of peripheral to the proceedings. It's just the proceedings. We got it on solicitor-client. That meant that all the communications between the council and its solicitors were covered. We got the costs of the experts. And the bill is $47,500 because the cost argument went forever as well. So it's a really interesting read, but yeah. Yeah, that's happening. Yeah.
$2 a week.
No. That's the next step. That's the next step. And I think the only saving grace is that the Scragg family has a lot of money behind it, so there will be some property to put a charge on. But you can see where this goes. And yeah, the cost implications. So to answer your question, yeah, costs are available, but they're pretty extraordinary circumstances. And you do need, in a planning appeal, very, very bad behaviour to get those costs.
Yeah, I was subject